All right, so we're on our next unit, unit number 2, and we got 2 parts to this one. But a lot of students actually like this one. I do prefer it as well. It's foreign policy. So when you right into it, this is around the same time period as the Gilded Age of Progressive Era. But we often forget sometimes that just because things are going domestically doesn't mean there's like nothing going on internationally that we're dealing with. A lot of stuff coincides. In this case, a lot of stuff is going on while we're dealing with the progressive era. We're also doing stuff internationally and on foreign issues as well. Let's get into rise of world power. Sometimes this is called America builds an empire. If you see my notes or my Quizlet, sometimes it comes down just a simple name like that, a little bit different. But essentially what it is when America becomes almost an empire and begins these imperialistic ideas. We hate to say it, and people will get that mad that we say that like we're bad guys, but we went through this process just like many other countries. So let's get right into it. It first starts with the Spanish-American War. Now, how we get the Spanish-American War, it actually starts if you go a little bit farther south, a little bit, about 100 miles south of Florida is a country named Cuba. Cuba at the time had been controlled by Spain. If you think back to earlier times, the New World was first rediscovered. Essentially, Spain had control over much of it. And over time, Spain has lost more and more control of all their colonies, but they still held on to Cuba and a few other ones barely. Now, at this point in time, Spain is not the beast it was when it was first exploring. Now it's like the old sick dog of a neighborhood that's barely getting by. It's not the tough dog ready to fight that it was before. It's actually pretty bad. But nonetheless, Spain is holding on to those colonies at all costs. And in Cuba, the people there, like many places, want a revolution. They want their independence. They want their sovereignty, right? And Spain's not giving it up. And there's rebellions, and they're crushed. There's fighting back, and it's crushed. And things are pretty bad. We do know there are camps where they put these rebellious people in. We do know there are executions. To the extent, though, it's kind of stretched at some point by a couple of newspapers like the New York World, Pulitzer's New York World, Hearst's New York Journal. These guys are in competition with each other. So it's not surprisingly that when one writes a paper that talks about the horrific things going down in Cuba by the Spaniards to the Cuban people, that the other newspaper comes out with one that's even more horrible, right? Because people are going to read that one. So these guys are competing with each other, and it creates almost what I tell my students now. I laugh and I say, hey, I guess you can say it's fake news. Back then we called it yellow journalism, and it was exaggerating the events in Cuba almost to a point where some of it was false. So you can say it's fake news now. But now the problem with newspapers and media is that they're trying to carry to one side at all costs, and clickbait, that's another reason, big problem too, right? But nonetheless, yellow journalism is what we call it when these two newspapers and other ones were competing with each other and sort of exaggerating news to the point where they were talking about the worst and most horrible things are happening. And it got to the point where Americans wanted to intervene. They wanted to go help Cuba. One senator put on the floor, he said, we should need to go help our little brown brothers in Cuba, essentially fight off the Spanish. But nonetheless, McKinley is president at the time, and he's like, nope, gotta avoid this, can't just go to war for this. Things get escalated a little bit with what we call the Lome letter. It was a Spanish ambassador sent this letter to Spain, telling them, don't worry about America. Americans are weak. The president is weak. McKinley himself is weak. And when Americans find out about this, because of course it's intercepted and published, Americans are even more furious. Americans are war hungry. It seems like every generation has this need, this desire for war to prove themselves. And the last war we talked about, Civil War, 1860-65, and now we're talking about 1898, the turn of the century. Things do escalate. McKinley, in a show of strength, and in his argument, he goes, hey, I am trying to protect economic interests in Cuba. We've got some American companies down there. He says, I'm going to send the USS Maine down to Cuba. It's posted off the harbor of Havana, Cuba specifically. And just to prove a point, it's just to prove that we're not, it's almost like a political maneuver. Like, you talk this mess, now everybody knows about it. I got to show you I'm not weak and do something. So he puts it down there and it stations down there, and then boom, mysteriously explodes. And when that happens, as you can see from the damage from us, when a ship explodes, we go to war. And essentially, Spain is blamed almost immediately, and we have a declaration of war. McKinley goes to Congress, asks for a declaration of war against Spain, and they give it to him. And of course, it's 1898. College textbooks often call it the War of 1898 and not the Spanish-American War because it involves a lot of other people besides the Spanish and Americans. As a matter of fact, we never go to Spain at all. We actually fight Spain in its colonies. They never fight in America at all, actually. So it's more, I guess, correct to call it War of 1898, but more often not in our TEKS, our standards in high school, it's called the Spanish-American War. But nonetheless, it starts in 1898 and ends really quick. I always tell students a couple things. You have to know the main is what causes the Spanish-American War. Later on, we talk about other ships with World War I, and my students always get these confused. So I always say, the best way to remember this, USS Maine leads to war with Spain. By the way, if you're at all interested in the reality of this, decades later when they have the technology actually bring the ship up and look at the inspections, and it looks like it appears that the explosion came from within the ship, not from outside. I originally thought there were like mines, water mines out there where or sea mines, where the ships bump them and they explode, or it was sabotage of some sort. But they put it up, and from the wreckage, you can see the explosion happen outward, right where the ammunition is kept on the ship. So it would appear that there was probably still a little cigarette where you weren't supposed to light it, and it exploded outward. But nonetheless, at the time, people don't think about what it could be, think of what it has to be, and they're furious and mad at Spain, and will go to war with them. And so you do have a couple here about you. Remember the Maine, that becomes a war cry. You have here some execution. Even these pictures that are published show starving Cuban children that show how bad it was, and executions. And it's a headlines like innocents executed in large numbers. What Spain was doing to Cubans was so horrible. It led all to this rather quickly, as a matter of fact. Now, here's a propaganda to show you. This is, I like to start showing this because at the turn of the century, we see this a bigger role in war. And I think this Civil War taught Americans this, and the world, that if the people at home give up on the war and don't feel motivated to fight, then the war is not going to last forever. You'll see some of these. This guy's obviously representing Spain. He's drawn as a brute, almost like an ape-like figure, which is very common in American culture when we talk about other cultures. And if we appear to think they're uncivilized, the brute ape-like image always comes to mind. And in this case, it's a Spain. He's holding a bloody knife. He's stepping on the American flag. There's American sailors dead in the background, and it says, the tombstone says, Maine sailors murdered by Spain. Right? Just to get you riled up and upset, still propaganda for you. Here's an interesting one. It's kind of blurry, but you can see that here is the U.S. saving Cuba. She's a damsel in distress. Here's the hero. Clearly the bad guy here, dressed in black, mischievous, has Spain written across his hat, nonetheless. Again, USS Spain sends us to war with Spain. USS Maine sends us to war with Spain. Sorry about that. Now, where does the war take place? If not in Spain, if not in the U.S., it's in her colonies, but not just only in Cuba. As a matter of fact, it's going to be a war on two fronts. We're going to start using that word a lot because the world, by the turn of the century, is expanding, and war is not easily fought in one area. As a matter of fact, we have, over here we have Philippines and Guam. Over here we have Puerto Rico and Cuba. Those all are going to be areas where we're going to fight the Spanish. So understand that the Philippines and Guam, we're talking about the Pacific Ocean over here. The United States is here. We've got Cuba and Puerto Rico over here. So it's fighting on both sides. In the Philippines, it actually happens rather quickly. There's a whole backstory to this if you get a chance to check it out. There's too much detail for this class. But the Assistant Secretary of Navy was Theodore Roosevelt, and he had already moved ships to this area just in case we went to World War Spain as things had escalated. And so when we did go to war with Spain, the U.S. Navy was there rather quickly and laid waste to the Spanish defenses on the Philippine Islands, and Americans come in. And the Philippines actually love this. The Philippines had wanted independence from Spain as well, and so Americans come in, and the Philippines actually helped the Americans fight the Spanish on the ground. And just like that, the U.S. takes control of the Philippines rather quickly. We are seeing our Navy built up during this time period, but we get more to that in a little bit. So the Philippines is taken pretty easy. Guam, a small tiny island, is taken pretty easy. And when you're looking at this like it's so far away, why do you want that land so far away? And there's a few reasons for this, but let's not get too far ahead of ourselves there. You guys see where we were stationed at in Hong Kong. At that time, the British owned Hong Kong, controlled Hong Kong, up until 1998 actually. But we borrowed the area for a base for our Navy fleet. So when the time did come, we were ready for that. And just like that, the U.S. is going to take control of Philippines from the Spanish and then keep it, but we get into that later too. All right, Secretary Theodore Roosevelt, he actually was, he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He resigns because he wants to see the fighting. He didn't want to sit behind a desk. He decides he's going to go, and he goes to the Army and say, and he raised a volunteer force of Rough Riders. And these guys are outlaws from Texas. These guys are outlaws from Wild West. These guys are Ivy League people he went to school with and played football with. These are Native Americans that helped him before. People from all different sorts, walks of life are going to join him to go fight in this war against the Spanish. They actually meet locally near us, near in San Antonio, called Minger Hotel. If you go to Minger Hotel in San Antonio now, right off the Riverwalk, you actually see a whole display case, a wall of Rough Rider things that they have kept over time, like a mini museum. That's pretty interesting. But nonetheless, Teddy Roosevelt organizes these guys together, the Rough Riders, and he'll go to battle. It's interesting. There's a drunk history. If you just drunk history, Teddy Roosevelt, Rough Riders, you'll see it. It's pretty interesting how much of it's historically accurate. There's a little that's not, but it's pretty interesting. But you can see from this, he's obviously victorious. It was San Juan Hill in Cuba that he was victorious on. And there's a lot to this when we see Roosevelt's rise as a hero. And people will know his name. The biggest thing about this Rough Rider situation, you know, is that this is how he becomes famous. This is how he eventually will become president, is because of this war, which isn't uncommon in American history. When you want to make a name for yourself, you go fight in a war, and it can elevate your status amongst the people. Now the U.S., as he conquered Cuba, he would do it on San Juan Hill, and other parts of Cuba are easily conquered. It's not difficult at all. Again, the Spanish are just holding on. Everybody knew how this was going to end. America's in an industrial might at its peak, even getting stronger, and Spain's just barely holding on. Outdated equipment, outdated weapons, nobody's motivated, outnumbered, because remember, the Cuban population does not like Spain either. So it's relatively easy. As a matter of fact, I think this is actually in this war, more Americans would die from malaria than anything else. But nonetheless, it's pretty successful, and Cuba is taken. And out of this, the U.S. government will have Cuba signed over to them eventually, but to this very day, they only keep part of it, and that's the Guantanamo Bay, which is a whole other story we want to talk about. But I put that under an underline kept, because we will get Cuba as a prize from the war, but we give Cuba its independence, sort of, not really. But no matter what, we keep Guantanamo Bay to this very day, 2024, we still have control over it. But that's Cuba locked up pretty easy. Puerto Rico was just an easy trip over, roll through and take it. I remember being in Puerto Rico one time. I was at one of the forts they had there, the oldest forts they have, and they were talking about the invasion of the Americans. And the students I were with were just insulted. They're like, we didn't invade. And I was like, yeah, we did. In the Spanish-American War of 1898, we invaded Puerto Rico. There wasn't much resistance, and it's relatively easily done. So that's the Caribbean wrapped up just like that. Cuba and Puerto Rico, done rather quickly. And again, if you're thinking, why is this? Spain was just weak. They're barely holding on to this. They just, any industrial might like the U.S., who is like the young, it's like a boxer. We're coming up, we're in our prime, and Spain's the old guy fighting one last battle, has no chance at all, just refuses to quit. So I do have a couple things underlined on here. I need you guys to know that we did get Cuba, Puerto Rico, Philippines, and Guam from the Spanish-American War. This is a time period we're going to expand, right? This is world power, right? An empire we're building. So it's not just these areas we get during this time, but from the Spanish-American War specifically, from this war we get those a few places. I've seen tests before. We actually have to know that the Philippines are in the Pacific. They don't say Philippines and Guam. They'll just say the Pacific. And you have to know that these islands are there. But nonetheless, just understand that. Make sure you circle, highlight in your notes, whatever you need to do. This is a game changer, because now the United States went from just being inside the U.S. to having the Philippines and having Puerto Rico, Cuba. We get some more stuff here during this time period in different ways. We'll buy some of it, take some of it. But nonetheless, the United States now has this international market, right? This international power. We are a world power at this time. That's why Spanish-American War is a turning point. Because now America is not just run-of-the-mill, normal country. Now we're special, we're different. We're a world power, and we're gonna compete with other world powers, especially those European powers. And if you think this is wrong, it's messed up to do this, to control other people, you're right. Ethically and morally, it's wrong. But at that point in time in history, everybody thought that was the only way you could be successful, the only way you could be strong, economically and military might. This is necessary. This is what you had to do. And so it's a widespread belief, which we'll talk about in a second. After this, if you're looking at what happened in Spain, it's done. Like, everybody knew this is bound to happen, so it's not surprising that it's always wiped out. Now, this concept of one country controlling another country or having some strong influence, but more likely controlling physically, economically, whatever it might be, this is called imperialism. You may have heard that word before. It's referenced quite a bit when we actually look at I don't know what I was thinking when I did this. When we look at world history, we see imperialism a lot. We always talk about the British imperialism, how they conquered so much. Spain, we never call them conquistadors, but it was imperialism, which is the same. And then in modern times, we talk about American imperialism. Much of the world talks about that. This is when it starts here. You can see this cartoon. You can actually see that this is Uncle Sam, who is starting to become more and more popular in the political cartoons. His pants here are made of California, Gadsden purchased Louisiana, purchased Florida, Texas, all these places that was added to the U.S. But his tailor is measuring him for a new suit. And a new suit is going to include cloth, and that extra new cloth is Guam, Philippines, Puerto Rico, Alaska, Hawaii, Samoa Islands, all these places we get during this time. And the name of that tailor is none other than the president at the time, McKinley. He is getting America ready for a new suit, measuring Uncle Sam for a new suit. Okay? So if you believe that we should take over these other countries, annex them, if you will, I have it underlined because it's just a vocab word some of my students don't know. But if you want to annex them, you're an imperialist, right? You wanted to do that. Imperialism, United States is holding this hand. It's a pretty good hand, right? It's straight, it's high. Cuba, Virgin Islands, Japan, Philippines, Caribbean. Those are areas we control. That's a pretty good hand to have in poker, in case you didn't know that. Imperialism, pretty good hand. Now, reasons why we want imperialism vary greatly from person to person, but there are some common ones. One, need for raw material. And this actually goes all the way back from Great Britain. Why take over any area? Well, if they have a material you want, you can keep it, control it, get that material for free, just take it from them, right? Or you can make, if they do pay for it, it's relatively cheap depending on the situation. I always think of like Belgium and the Congo. That's one of the most extreme cases of desperate need for raw material and the most violent control of imperialism you've ever seen. Strategic reasons, I'm gonna get into those. I'm gonna come back to that in just a second because we got a list of strategic reasons. Nationalism was a pride in nations. This is a point in time, this is right before World War I, where every country felt like, hey, you're not world power unless you control other people and have territories all over the world. That was what makes you a world power. So everybody's desperate to do that just because Britain had done it before and they were an empire. What do I have to do to do it? And Germany's doing the same thing. What do we have to do? Where can we take? Everybody's trying to take areas to become that world power. 4, attitudes towards other people. Sorry. The average idea Americans had of somebody from the Philippines wasn't favorable. In modern times, we can say, hey, people, if they practice a different religion, that doesn't make them right or wrong, that makes them different. Like there are some that's gonna say right or wrong, but that's religion, right? I mean, religious beliefs, people have other religions. But the attitudes were other people, they needed us. We were doing them a favor by conquering them, forcing them to become more American, forcing them to become maybe more Christian, maybe whatever the case might be. We had these attitudes towards other people that they were inferior and they needed us. We were doing them a favor. Or we had to help them. We had to save the day. We had to help our Cuban brothers. They needed us. We had to save them from it. So attitudes toward other people, it can be looked at different ways. The strategic reasons are a big important thing. And I always tell my students this is going to be asked on the test. But Alfred T. Mahon had wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power on History. And in this book, He wrote, in order to have an empire, you need a few things. And so if America wants to be an empire, it's going to need the following. Number one, you need a powerful, big navy. Makes sense. If you want an empire, you've got to have land everywhere. You got to take over land. You have to control that land. You need to maintain that control over that land. And you can't only do that with a navy, right? Planes don't exist yet, so navy is the focus here. If you have a large enough navy and you want to get, say, from the United States to the island you just took over in the Philippines, you might not be able to make it there in one trip. You're going to have to stop along the way and resupply. This is a time where it's like coal ships. And eventually you get to diesel ships. Nonetheless, you have to resupply. And so you need naval bases. If you have Hawaii, like Pearl Harbor as a naval base, Guam as a naval base, just to get to the Philippines, you might have a naval base there to get to China, whatever the case might be, you need naval bases to resupply your ships as almost like a pit stop on the way. Almost think of it like a road trip. You can't make it all the way there on half a tank of gas or full tank of gas. You gotta stop somewhere and get gas. That's, if you look at these islands in the Pacific, these are all small stops for us. These are all areas where we should have at one point in time. And we're slowly making our way over to Asia. So that's why we need naval bases. You gotta have a navy. If you gotta have a big navy, you gotta have naval bases. The next thing is actually very unique for us as a country. So we have two coastlines on the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. And on those two coastlines, we can't move ships back and forth rather easy. At this point in time, you have to go all the way down below South America and come back up. It takes days, takes months longer. It's much more difficult. So in his book, he goes, what we also need, besides the Navy, besides bases for that Navy, we need a canal. Somewhere in Latin America, we need a canal connecting the Pacific to Atlantic. So that if we do need to get our ships over on the other side quickly, we have that option. So that became an essential part. These are the three strategic reasons I was talking about up here. And I always tell my students you have to know all three. You have to know it's Alfred T. Mahon, Admiral Alfred T. Mahon. You have to know he wrote the book and it's in the book. Because the test can ask you, and get an excerpt, and you have to figure out what he's saying that we need. He might be describing a navy, he might be describing naval bases. It could be, where does this come from? And you might have to know the author's name or the name of the book. Excuse me. Either way, you have to know the name of the guy, the book, and these three reasons. Definitely will be on the test, without a shadow of doubt. Now, people against imperialism will call it anti-imperialist. Ironically enough, this is not on your STAAR test or your test, say TEKS don't, which doesn't think you need to know about anti-imperialists. It seems like these probably were the minority group, and you're right, but not by a lot. There was a strong presence against, a strong concept against imperialism. Guys like Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie were the ones who were like, hey, this isn't right. You see these cartoons actually show that too. You see Uncle Sam representing the United States, and over here, this guy's representing Great Britain. He's carrying China, India, other areas that he's controlled, like other colonies of his. And America now is carrying Hawaii, Cuba, Puerto Rico. These are areas, the Philippines, these are areas we now control. But we're carrying them over the rocks of superstition, ignorance, vice, brutality, slavery, barbarianism, everything that they are, and we're carrying them to civilization. And you're thinking, how is that anti-imperialist? Well, it has a phrase at the bottom called the white man's burden, which is commonly referenced in modern times, even now, is that the Western world, America, Canada, Europe, feels the desire that other peoples can't take care of themselves, so they need us to do it for them. So we have to carry them over all the stuff to get to the top, but this is a white man's burden. So the title of it actually references just how ridiculous this is. Over here, I pulled this from a different country, a cartoon from a different country, as a matter of fact. And there you actually have Uncle Sam grabbing Cuba and other areas. And it's not very flattering. It's not a very flattering picture, and it's not meant to be. Clearly, you can see that if you actually translate it, how the U.S. is the bad guy in this with imperialism. Another anti-imperialist cartoon is actually one of my favorite ones. There's so much going on here if you take a look at this. I'll just hit it for a little bit. But you see Uncle Sam is teaching School Begins. Uncle Sam says this to his new classes, and the class is called Civilization. He says, now children, you've got to learn these lessons whether you want to or not. But just take a look at the class ahead of you. And remember that in a little while, you will feel as glad to be here as they are. And if you look at the class ahead of them, it's the new territories the United States acquired. Alaska, Texas, Arizona, California, New Mexico. They all went through the same thing you went through Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, just do what you're told and you'll be happy to be here, right? There's the new class, there's a list of the states, or territories and states eventually. U.S. first lessons in self-government. And it says up here, the Confederates refused their consent to be governed. Confederate states, remember they did in the Civil War, they refused to be governed, but the Union was preserved without the South's consent. So just like the South didn't have a say-so and we forced them to be together and it's better for everybody, so should be you. There's even more to this. The consent of the governed is a good thing in theory, but very rare in fact. England has governed her colonies whether they consented or not. By not waiting for the consent, she has greatly advanced their world civilization. It's a common thing people have now. They say, hey, things are better. One student of mine once referenced slavery had to happen, which is a powerful thing to say. But nonetheless, it's an idea that it's better for everybody if you just let us do this. I like the irony of this cartoon because if you look in the back, you can actually see this character represents Native Americans. He's not getting a fair education. He's put to the side like as if on a reservation. His education isn't near as good. His book's even upside down to show how he's treated. Another hypocrisy about this is the African American ex-slaves, free slaves. Are they getting an education? No, we got Jim Crow laws that says they can't get an education at all, and they just clean and that's it. Over here outside, the kid is not even allowed to come in. Where is he from? None other than China. A reference to this Chinese exclusion policy of immigrants coming over, right? So it's a really, it's a good cartoon because it shows the hypocrisy of Uncle Sam in the first place. So you can actually break this up quite a bit. It's one of my favorite cartoons of the time to show the anti-imperialistic point of view. Now again, I always tell my students, make sure you know the countries we've obtained from the Spanish-American War. That's important. Know where they're at per se if it's a reference. Like if I'm referencing this on a test, I might say in the Pacific. I don't want you thinking Puerto Rico happened in the Pacific. Puerto Rico is over here in Atlantic and Caribbean. Over here in Pacific, we have Guam, Philippines, things like that. And one year on our state tests, I believe it was last year, a couple years ago, it referenced that Guam was in the Philippines. And you had to know Guam was in the Philippines. But I also like this map because it just shows us, if we're trying to make our way over to the Philippines, we can stop at Hawaii, Midway Island, Wake Island, Guam, Philippines. We have all these bases on the way to refuel our ships, to resupply our ships, but also to defense against us all the way. And this all plays a big role when it comes down to, in the future, when we get to World War II, in case you're wondering about Pearl Harbor and the Philippine Islands, that plays a huge role. What we do here in 1898, by getting these territories, it actually sets forth history in motion that you can't imagine that has a huge effect. Right. Now, real quick, we do get the Philippines by one vote. It's pretty interesting. The ratification was, the argument was like, should we give these people independence or should we actually use them as a territory? And the massive debate was pretty split. Just by one vote, we're going to annex the Philippines and make it a U.S. territory. The Philippine people immediately go to war with us, and we spent a couple years putting down that rebellion in the Philippines to control them. Ironic enough, we freed them from Spain's control right before that and decided to do that. Later on, when War II approaches, we get into it with Japan. Before Japan bombs Pearl Harbor, we cut off trade to Japan because what Japan had done over the course of the 30s and early 40s is they had expanded their control over Asia to pretty much surround the Philippines. They didn't go to war against the Philippines. They didn't try to conquer the Philippines. That would have meant war with the United States. And we're actually the #1 supplier to them for oil and scrap metals and everything else. Little Japan themselves, they couldn't have enough material for war itself. They had to buy it from the US. And what we actually tell them when they are expanding in the late 30s, early 40s, right before World War II, we'd say, hey, you guys gotta stop. You're getting too close to the Philippines. You actually invaded China, who's an ally of ours. And so we tell Japan that we're going to put an embargo and we're not gonna trade with them anymore. That's actually why Japan decided, hey, we have to attack the United States at some point. It's just a matter of time before we go to war with them. And they decided they're gonna attack Pearl Harbor. All because we were worried about the Philippines. And we told them no more trading because you get too close to the Philippines. And so they decide, okay, we've got to go to war with America, essentially. But that's a whole other story. We'll talk about Pearl Harbor. But just the fact that if we had never annexed the Philippines and gave them independence, I don't know if we would ever cut off oil to Japan. And if we never would cut off oil to Japan, would they have ever attacked Pearl Harbor? If they never attacked Pearl Harbor, we would never have declared war on Japan. If we never declared war on Japan, Hitler would never declare war on us, and we would never went to Europe. It's interesting how that one vote makes the world of difference, right? As far as Cuba goes, we will, I'll come back to Cuba in a little bit, but we are going to finalize, essentially, we do get Cuba, but there was a deal with Congress that if we did beat Spain, we wouldn't keep Cuba. We would let them be independent, but I'll get to that whole excuse second. Puerto Rico pretty much rolls over and it becomes territory, and even now, in modern times, they voted and they want to become a state, but we'll see how that rolls. Now, not all the land acquired at this time actually is done from war. Hawaii itself, the United States, just steals pretty much. The queen there is the last surviving queen. The natives have had control. They've never been colonized, but American businessmen have been there, and they have pretty much controlled the property. Slowly they've gathered it up. It's a great place for plantations. One rich businessman there is a guy named Sanford B. Dole. He'll convince local Marines to overthrow the queen, take control, and establish himself as leader of Hawaii. And when he writes to the United States, he says, I've got control, I'm ready to annex it. The president at the time looks at this and actually says, hey, this isn't right, you can't do this. You cannot command Marines to do this. You cannot, we're not accepting this. But after the Spanish-American War, the United States has changed their mind a little bit. And they're gonna consider doing this, say, okay, we're gonna annex Hawaii. And Dole becomes the first governor of Hawaii, as a matter of fact. And so when you take the STAAR test, it's pretty straightforward. If you remember Dole, governor of Hawaii, you're almost always fine. You can't get that wrong if you know that. He said he was the first president, that's why I have this written up here, for just a few years. Once America decides to annex it, then he's appointed the first governor. But nonetheless, he stole it. He just took it from the queen. It wasn't legal at all. He just literally had a coup d'etat and overthrew the government there. You can see the cartoon, the Senate has far-reaching out to Hawaiian sugar, from Cuba sugar, and U.S. sugar. You can clearly see the commodity we're after here for free. The natural resource we want is the money that we get from sugar. That's actually true from that point. So nonetheless, Dole, Hawaii, and you'll be good there. Now, we don't stop there. We look out past the Philippines and we see a large country here called China. That's how close is the Philippines. And the United States looks at China, such a huge population, and in many sections of China is essentially claimed by countries. It's an influence we have. They call it spheres of influence. But nonetheless, if you look at this, you can see in green, the British have influence there. If the British have influence there, that means those people in green only trade with the British. In the yellow is the French. The French have control there and influence there, which means the Chinese people there can only trade and sell to the French. We've got the Germans, we got the Japanese, the Russians as well. That's where they control. The people in that area have to sell to them and nobody else. So when we get to the Philippines, we finally hit the Philippines and we look to China, we want to sell to people there. That creates an international market, which means the more consumers you have, the more market you have, right? So if I have more consumers, more money, great, that's what we want, right? We were really big on national market with the railroads in America. Fast forward a few years, and now we want an international market. We want to sell to everybody we can, including the huge population of China. But we look at China and there's nothing left for us. We're too late. The Secretary of State, John Hay, decides, you know what? We're going to have the open door policy with China. He declares open door policy, means that the United States can sell trade with any part of China, regardless of who has influence on it. Now, if you're wondering why we're so cocky to do that, after the Spanish-American War, we are a different country. We really have a large Navy, we have the investments, and it's to the point where we're going to make this claim and nobody's going to push back. That would be war with us. And after what they saw what happened with the Spanish-American War, few countries will be willing to do that. If you take a look at this cartoon here, you see everybody's dividing up China. We've got England, she represents England, we've got representing Germany, Russia, with the Japanese, the French. They're all dividing up China, but the Chinese people are saying, no, wait. But if you look at this closely, this is an American cartoon, obviously. The Chinese man is not very flattering, is he? He's almost like a beast, animal, mischievous. Like, look at his teeth, he has claws. He's not in a flattering light. And this should tell you something about how Americans felt about the Chinese. Now, the Chinese felt the same way about Americans, don't get me wrong. The Boxer Rebellion proved that. The people of China decided, it was a secret organization, a secret martial arts organization, decided to rebel essentially against the imperialists, the people that were in China, trying to control them, including the Americans. An international army was put together by these European forces and us. America was sent 5,000 troops over there to squash the Boxer Rebellion. So when you think of, wow, we always fight for independence and democracy, we crushed it in several times throughout history, including when China wanted its independence. But nonetheless, that's the story now. Just make sure you know Boxer Rebellion, and make sure you understand open door policy. Now, if you're thinking, why, how dare you do the open door policy, or you're just cocky, and you're right. So you can't see from this cartoon because it's too blurry, but this is an open door policy, and the book that's holding it open says U.S. Army and U.S. Navy. So it should tell you why we think we can get away with this. Here's another cartoon I like. It shows China, and doors are open. You've got Uncle Sam holding the key to it, and it says American diplomacy. And all these other guys represent different countries, from England to Germany to France to Russia, right? The Japanese are helping out there as well. These guys are just waiting, looking up and seeing he's got the key to it, and it's open to everybody with that declaration of open door policy to China. It's ironic because we're refusing to let the Chinese people in because they could be so evil, so bad. In 1882, right? The Chinese Exclusion Act. But also now we're trying to get in to China at all costs because we want to sell it to all these people. Now people are like, whoa, well, China and Japan are right next to each other. Why? How come nobody's conquering Japan? Why is it Japan's actually conquering China and Japan's here? Japan has influence here. Well, early on, as early as 1853, the United States had sent a ship to Japan to trade with it. And by the 1890s, we had enforced that trading essentially, and Japan had adapted to the Western ways, including industry, which means they were producing things at a massive scale too. They were developing their army, their navy so strong. 1905, they would actually go to war with Russia. This huge Russia, this huge country, European country for that, fact of the matter, and it's Russia, so it's huge. And this little bitty island of Japan would go to war with them, and Japan's navy will beat the crap out of Russia's navy. And it looks really, really bad for Russia. If you're wondering what happened with Russia, this is one of the things that leads to the czars essentially later on during World War I, but we'll talk about that later. But nonetheless, Japan humiliates. It's shocking to the world. An Asian country, these quote-unquote uncivilized people, just beat a European country, that being Russia. And it actually escalates pretty bad. Russia vows they're not going to give up. It's going to look pretty bad. But one man enters named Teddy Roosevelt, and he'll get into the Russian Tsar and the Japanese Emperor to negotiate a treaty, a peace treaty, and stop fighting each other. He steps in to fix that situation. And for that, Teddy Roosevelt was the first president to get a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. So the Treaty of Portsmouth is actually what it's called. He gets these guys to agree to stop fighting each other. Here I have a link to a movie, but you can just YouTube The Last Samurai. It kind of plays a reference shortly after, the movie takes place after Civil War, when the U.S. is sending military to Japan to turn Japan into a military ally and to sell military goods to Japan. So it's interesting because it shows a clash of the old culture of the samurai and this new culture taking over. Japan is just dominant military. They're pretty brutal. One story goes that in Japan during this time period, this kid was dissecting an animal in class and he started crying because the animal had died, and the teacher slaps him. This is what are you going to do when we invade China later? So this military attitude and this Bushido code that we saw with the samurai, it kind of almost transfers over to industry. And we see this with Japan. Which should be surprising what they do during World War II after this, years later. But nonetheless, this is how, as far as STAAR test goes, you didn't know, Teddy Roosevelt, Nobel Peace Prize for the Treaty of Portsmouth that ended the Russo and Japanese War. Now, other reasons why that takes care of the Asian Pacific, or the Pacific, we're done with over the Asia Pacific area. The Caribbean is known as America's Lake. Gives us security. We always said Puerto Rico was like a lighthouse, and if anything came at us from the Atlantic Ocean, Puerto Rico would be the first one to find about it or know about it. Now, we're going to stay interested in this area because of economic interest. A lot of plantations here, just like sugar plantations, banana plantations, and so on. But also, we really need that canal. Teddy Roosevelt's president, he knows we need that canal, right? Puerto Rico, we get after the Spanish-American War. Cuba, we're going to give them independence, but when we gave them independence, we had an amendment written into the Constitution called the Platt Amendment that gave the U.S. a right to intervene in Cuba affairs at any time. So we give them, quote unquote, independence, but not really. That's why for the next 60 years, Cuba's a mess. From 1900s to 1960s, it's a mess. And it's actually America's fault. We're intervening consistently for the interests of our companies, American companies that are there, to the point where even there's like a mafia, a Miami mafia that has the most control of Cuba and runs it. That's why in the 60s, when Fidel Castro overthrows, he has no problem overthrowing because the Cuban people get behind him for force because they're sick of the conditions that the Americans were imposing on them by putting certain people in charge in Cuba. But nonetheless, Cuba is given quote-unquote independence. We never give up Guantanamo Bay. Even when we go to war with Cuba, or we have the Cold War, and we have an embargo against Cuba in the 60s, we never give Guantanamo Bay. And they never attack it either. That's the one thing you just couldn't do. Nonetheless, Cuba is going to be given its own control, sort of. Now we get to the focus of, okay, one of the big things Mahon wanted in that book, remember, he said he wanted Navy, naval bases, and again, he wanted a canal to connect both sides, and to get that. Actually, looks out. Panama itself was actually controlled by Colombia at the time, and they had let a French company come to try to build this canal, and the French company failed. The French company was the same French company that built this Suez Canal on the other side of the world. But Suez Canal was easy. It was level. You just cut out land, and just filled it up, and that was it. The Panama Canal is much more difficult because you have different elevations throughout it. But that's not even what stopped the French company. What stopped them was this little guy right here, mosquito. Mosquito spreads yellow fever, malaria, and other things, and it was killing workers by the thousands. The French gave up and left. But before they left, they sold the contract to an American company. And so it sounded great. America's going to build this canal in Panama. When America buys this, Colombia says, no. Americans, you're not allowed down here. We know how this works. You'll never leave. Teddy Roosevelt decides he's going to make a decision. He calls up Panama, not calls him up, but he sends a message to Panama and says, Panama, you guys should fight for independence against Colombia. Of course, Panama is a tiny little country, tiny little area. Like, we could never do that. We could never get that done. We can't take on Colombia. Teddy Roosevelt says, no problem, I'll fix that. He sends a ship down to the coast off Colombia, points the guns at Colombia, and sends Colombia a message that says, Panama is now independent. Do you have any problem with that? Look outside. Not word from word like that, obviously, but a catchphrase, or paraphrase it, essentially. Colombia says, you know what? You can have it. Be independent. Goodbye. Good luck with that. And that's how the United States will get Panama's independence. The United States will dig the Panama Canal and control that canal for decades. They'll control it from the Panama people. The big thing about the discovery on this is that the Panama Canal is a discovery of what leads to all these deaths. After the Spanish-American War, so many people had died from malaria and yellow fever that they eventually figured out then that it was mosquitoes. The French didn't know that. It was mosquitoes that spread the disease. But because of our involvement in the Spanish-American War, doctors like Dr. Walter Reed had discovered, hey, yellow fever is spread by mosquitoes. So one doctor recommends cutting down vegetation and spraying the water with oil. Because if you don't know this, mosquitoes actually lay their eggs on top of water. That's why you always pour out water so you get rid of mosquitoes. But if you spray oil on top of the water, it kills everything. Not too good for environment, right? But it kills everything, and you cut down all the vegetation, you have less mosquitoes. And yes, hundreds would still die, but not in the huge numbers the French were losing that fast. This Panama Canal will be cut through here, 51 lengths, 51 miles long, so it's not just a short little route. It takes 10 years to build, and these different locks where you come into one area, this wall comes up behind you, and it fills up with water, and then you go across, and then the other wall comes up higher behind you, and this other wall comes up, or is already up, and it fills up with water, and your boat floats on top of that water to the next level. And then you get to the other side, and you go back down. Those are called locks, how you move your way up. You can Google this if you want to see images. My class will show videos, but here, I can just only explain it on on this video. But nonetheless, it's very difficult. Because $400 million, the United States will keep it and make their money back all the way up until the 70s when Carter agreed to give it back. Jimmy Carter agreed to give it back to them. But nonetheless, we create the canal, and that's like the golden piece for Alfred T. Mahon's concept and his ideas. Now, how we did that, remember Teddy Roosevelt threatened Colombia with the ships. He rolled them out and said, boom, I dare you, pretty much. And that's a concept you understand. Teddy Roosevelt has what he calls a big stick policy. Speak softly, but carry a big stick. His big stick is a metaphor for the U.S. Navy. He says you don't talk a lot of mess, but always have something to back it up, if you can think of that. And so when he sent that Navy down, he was flexing and showing his big stick policy. He goes, look what we have the Navy. He will take that farther. He'll actually go to a point where he'll send have a fresh painted Navy fleet, send it on a tour around the world, just so everybody can see it. Off the coastline, there's these giant metal, huge steel ships. They're all steamingly clean white. They're brand new. There's so many of them. What country is that? What country has that kind of power? What kind of strength? That kind of money? And everybody's like, that's the American Navy. Speak softly, but carry a big stick. And the big stick is his Navy. If you look here, you see a picture of Teddy Roosevelt carrying a big stick. He's pulling around the Navy. It says everything from debt collector to sheriffs, everything. He's taking all around the Caribbean Sea. The reason why you have debt collector is because Roosevelt has a little problem when he's president. Turns out a Latin American country had owed money to Great Britain. Great Britain had loaned them money. This Latin American country couldn't pay it, so Great Britain said, we're going to go down there and control your country until we get money. And Franklin Roosevelt says, oh, you can't do this, man. We have this thing called the Monroe Doctrine a while back that says you can't do this. You can't come back and make colonies. And that's what you're going to do. You stay here to get your money, but we know what's going to happen. So Roosevelt has the Roosevelt corollary. And if you look at the word corollary, if you look at the definition, it just means an addition to something. And this is Roosevelt saying this. So Roosevelt's corollary is an addition to the Monroe Doctrine that says the following. It says, hey, it's not just you won't come over and colonize, but if you have a problem, we will take care of it. You have a financial problem, we'll pay that debt, and then we'll go down there and take care of the country. You have any problem over here, you have to come through us first. So Roosevelt corollary was just an addition to the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe Doctrine says, stay out, we'll stay out of there, you stay out of here, we'll be all good. But this said, hey, if you have any problem at all, we'll take care of it. Corollary is just an addition to the Monroe Doctrine. That's all we're talking about here. Don't overthink it. You can see from this one, we've got Teddy Roosevelt. He is policing, right? From one side of Latin America to the Europeans on the other side. And his new diplomacy is a big stick, right? This is Roosevelt's legacy as a politician, as a foreign leader, as well as Roosevelt corollary, and the threat of the big stick. He really builds up that Navy. Remember, he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He did value Mahon's book, and he thought the same thing, and he thought that was right. Now, I talked to you before in the last section, Teddy Roosevelt eventually does leave the presidency. He has to, unfortunately, and a guy named William Taft comes over. I always have this cartoon, because the famous joke is that he got stuck in a bathtub at the White House. He's a rather large man. If you Google him, 350 pounds. I had somebody Googled him the other day in class for me. He's 350 pounds, and bathtubs back then were pretty small, and he ends up getting stuck in a White House bathtub, supposedly. So that's probably his most famous thing he's known for, Taft, at least. Taft takes over after Teddy leaves, and Taft, we always talk about how he messed everything up back home. Foreign policy, Taft encourages dollar diplomacy. You gotta know this one. Dollar diplomacy is just essentially Americans giving money to Latin American countries. And by giving them money, they're gonna have say-so in the country's process, everything the country does, from its military to its government, how it's run, everything. And if you don't pay that money back, we'll send troops. And that happened in Nicaragua. Eventually, they failed to pay the U.S. bankers back, so we're going to send troops in. And from 1912 to 1933, troops were controlling the country. I put that date on it, so it should tell you clearly. This wasn't like, hey, we're going to invade, get our money, and then leave. No, this gives us a reason to come down there and control you. Think of it. Anytime a country gives another country money, that country owes a debt. And so the country has to bend to its knees and do exactly what it wants. If we actually look at how many times the U.S. has meddled in Latin America since 1898, it's a lot. So sometimes it's directly involved with Panama, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Mexico. A lot of times, sometimes it's proxy, which means that we'll start a war between two sides and then wait for it to end. Some of this is because of the Cold War. Some of it goes back to this time period. Like we had troops all throughout Latin America up until 1930s. We had the Great Depression and we can't afford it anymore. But nonetheless, it's pretty nuts how Americans go down there and conquer areas and never officially make it a territory, but we'll stay there and control the area. This is when America starts doing that. You can start to see why Latin America has such a distrust of Americans. Over the past 100 years, we've done this, and we actually created civil wars. We're responsible for a lot. If you look at things like Salvador and Guatemala, some of the problems there we've created, and it really plays a role in the future. Make sure you know what dollar diplomacy is. It's the idea, again, of the United States loaning money to other countries, and in turn being able to control those countries, influence them. And sometimes going down there and military controlling them as well, not just influencing them and telling them what to do. Some people look at this definition as, instead of using military might to control the country, use economic might. His policy task said, the policy of dollar diplomacy is one that appeals alike to the idealistic humanitarian sentiments, to dictates of sound policy and strategy, and to legitimate commercial aims. Commercial aims meaning economic aims, plantations, things like that as well. So keep that in mind. That's TAF and dollar diplomacy. You've got to know that one. That's my last slide, so I'm glad you stuck with me this long. But at the very end, when we have all this going on, eventually Taft is no longer president, Wilson comes in, and Wilson's president just for a short time before he has to deal with World War I. And he actually has to deal with a man named Pancho Villa. Just to show you how Americans intervened so many times in Latin America, this is just another case. Pancho Villa was a rebel leader in Mexico. He was a rebel in the north. There's another rebel in the south, Zapata. A lot of people know about him. But he was in control in the north. First, he was loved by Americans. There's even a film in Hollywood at the time that was made called Pancho Villa, where film directors from Hollywood came down to film him as he literally fought the Mexican government for independence. People loved him at first. He was like the George Washington of Mexico. But eventually Americans will get sick of him and hate him. See, Pancho Villa, he had money for a while, but rebellions cost money, and eventually he was losing more and more. At one point, he had to raid American towns. He had to go over, he sent guys over to raid American towns, rob, get money, and leave. And eventually Wilson had enough of that, and he would send a guy named Pershing, right here, to go after Pancho Villa. Now you're thinking, why are they happy in this picture? Because this shows you how great people liked Pancho Villa before he attacked America. This is Pancho Villa, this is one of his, another general. This is Pershing. Supposedly this guy back here is Eisenhower, I don't know. That's always a big debate. Or sorry, Patton. People say that's Patton, I don't know. Nobody knows for sure. Every time I ask anybody, they're like, I don't know. But Pershing is here, and Villa is here. This is before Pancho Villa gets desperate and starts attacking American outposts in Texas. But it's one of the most famous pictures. But after Pancho Villa gets desperate for money, he'll do that. And Wilson, President Wilson, will send Pershing, General John J. Pershing, to chase after Pancho Villa. Let me see from the cartoon that shows that. It says, I had about enough of this. And there goes Sam chasing after Pancho Villa. But Pershing never gets to him. Oddly enough, Pershing goes deep into Mexico without a declaration of war, without Mexico's permission, just invades the country, just like they did other Latin American countries. Pershing can never catch Pancho Villa. As a matter of fact, Pershing never even gets to finish it and tries, because essentially he gets a telegraph that says, how well do you know French? Because you're going to Europe. And that telegraph meant that we're going to World War I, come back to America, you're going to be leading the troops, the AFE, in World War I in Europe. And so it's he gets that far essentially before he just gives up. Now all this, I've got questions at the bottom for those in my class who have access to PowerPoint. You can go down to the bottom and see these questions, just for some practice. But just keep in mind, this changes everything. The Spanish-American War gives us war power and also influences everything else afterwards. And we pick up here this rise of world power, our empire. When we talk about U.S. history doing it, every other country is doing it. So if every other country is doing it, eventually they're all going to clash with each other, and we're going to have a great war, which is our next section.